Over the years, video games have given us hundreds, if not thousands, of different places to explore. From the humble 8-bit platformer to the vast expanses of an MMORPG, gamers have plenty of choice when it comes to escaping to a world that is not their own. However, no other genre can quite compare to the unique experiences offered by the open world game. From obvious choices such as Minecraft, Zelda, Final Fantasy, Grand Theft Auto, and Assassin's Creed, to the more distinct open-world designs of Dark Souls, Metroid, and Castlevania, open-world games have become so ubiquitous to gaming that they're practically their own genre, but they exist in nearly every type of game and have done for a long time, even if it's not so obvious at first. In learning about designing an open-world game, we will not only be looking at the world itself and the things we put in it, but also the unique interactions they have with other game mechanics such as story and player choice. We'll look at games that thrive in their open world by maximizing its potential, and others that only crush themselves under the weight of theirs. Welcome to Game Mechanics Explored. It would probably be best to start by defining what I mean by an open world game. To me, the definition isn't really concrete, nor should it be. Most video games today saw their earliest origins in the war games of the late 18th century, a common military practice for evaluating and visualizing battle strategies. This would later morph over a couple of centuries into the more recognizable Dungeons & Dragons, a classic tabletop game of truly infinite possibilities, and an open world that could be as big and as fantastical as your imagination could conjure. Game designers could take their own worlds from these kinds of tabletop role-playing games to the burgeoning market of home computers, and alongside the growing interest of programming and coding in the general public, the video game market was suddenly inundated with something more, something deeper than the previous offerings of shooting aliens or asteroids or squares. Suddenly, we had an epic story, a noble quest, and a vast open world to explore along the way. In fact, this explosion of early RPGs into the video gaming scene was so massive that the true origin of today's open world games is all but a matter of perspective. Much like the definition, its history spans too far and too wide to set anything in stone. All we need to know for today's discussion is that the idea of an open world game has been around for even longer than video gaming itself, and though its definition may have changed a lot since then, the broad strokes are right there in the name: open world. As more genres of video games were created over the years, that definition only became more and more vague. In the 70s, it was relegated to the likes of text adventures and flight simulators. Now we have open worlds in RPGs, action adventures, roguelikes, first and third person shooters. Even some racing games have their own open worlds. As technology grew and broke even more barriers to what could be done with video games, the open world only became more open and complex, and will likely continue that way for a long time to come. In fact, one of the issues I wanted to explore today is, with the ever-increasing strength of our gaming hardware, is bigger always better? While I would love to make a video exploring each and every type of open world game in each and every genre, and explore each and every unique challenge that designing such a world would pose, I'm afraid that such a video is slightly outside my remit and would probably end up going for a few days. I'm making these videos for two reasons. I'm making my own game and I want to explore the game mechanics that I'll likely encounter when designing it. Think of these videos as my own strange attempt to study a particular game mechanic so that we can later use that knowledge for our design process down the line. A process that will showcase in other videos. The other reason is simply that I like talking about game design, and I hope that you'll enjoy listening to me talking about game design, because I'll probably end up talking for a while. It's something that fascinates me greatly, and while these videos will mostly focus on the design aspects of the game that I want to make, there are still hundreds of areas we can explore. So, what type of open world are we exploring today? Ever since I was young, I've found myself gravitating to the likes of GTA, with San Andreas being a particular favourite of mine. I have vivid memories of simply driving around and playing with cheat codes, the code for the jetpack being deeply ingrained in my muscle memory. I never actually completed the game until a couple of years ago, but I fondly remember San Andreas as sparking my love for these kinds of games. When I got older and moved from my PS2 to the Xbox 360, my palette for open world games only expanded, with Oblivion and Fallout 3 growing into Far Cry, Saints Row, Just Cause, Red Faction, Assassin's Creed and LA Noire. Then onto God of War, Dark Souls, Shadow of Mordor and Horizon Zero Dawn. As my passion for gaming exploded in my early teens, my collection of pre-2000s titles opened me up to the predecessors of my favourite games: Final Fantasy, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid. The list of open world games I've sank my time into is massive, and each game I've listed and dozens more have contributed to my idea of the perfect open world experience, at least for me anyway. A great man who, for the life of me I can't remember the name of, once said that art is an ongoing conversation, and because video games are in fact art, I feel that applies well to how I approach game design. I'm not trying to change the status quo. I'm not trying to innovate anything just for the sake of saying I innovated something. You can't get to the top without climbing upon the foundations, and as much as the entirety of video gaming itself finds its roots in a nearly 3-century-old military practice, most, if not all, aspects of game design can be traced back quite far through its near 50 years of history. My open world will be mine. All the minutiae and details that will go into it will be there because I decided it will be there. But those decisions will be influenced by my experiences with the games that I have played. Art doesn't exist in a vacuum. If you're a big fan of JRPGs, does it not stand to reason that your video game might resemble one? This video shouldn't be taken as a gold standard of open world design. Rather, I want this to be a reflection on the games that influence me today. We'll set out a few scenarios that open world games pose, and explore them a bit more in depth. If we just did what every other game did, it would get boring very quickly. If we tried to break from every convention going, we'd end up with something awful. We'll see what the games do, then we'll see what we can do. For a few years, it seemed like open world games were trying to outdo each other in just how big they could make their maps. Just Cause 2 is a prime example of a game whose map is just ridiculously big. If you were to walk from one end to the other, it would take you around 3 hours. When Skyrim first came out, it was lauded for its size, and many games since have pushed the envelope with just how big an open world could be. And herein lies the issue I brought up before. Is bigger always better? So, I'll present 2 games in which bigger was better, and a game where it was most certainly not the case. In the bigger is better corner, we have The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. For a game whose reception was so split when it first came out, Wind Waker has aged like a fine wine over the past 18 years, and I feel that both its split consensus and its quality were both a result of its far bigger world compared to previous titles. In case you don't know, the Wind Waker took the lovely hike across Hyrule Field, or Termina, and sank it to the bottom of the ocean where it apparently belonged. Now, instead of walking from A to B, you have to sail there on your very own talking boat. The gameplay was forced apart at its overworld seams to stuff in some extra gameplay opportunities. The sailing mechanic is often a Marmite situation. You either love it or you hate it. I'm in the love it camp, because despite all my no such thing as innovation nonsense a few minutes ago, It did something truly unique for a Zelda game, and that really adds something, in my opinion, to a rather stifled gameplay loop. Nintendo took the mere act of getting around and made something unique. In fact, I don't think another game of this scale would be attempted again until Assassin's Creed Black Flag, but I could be wrong there. I like games that do something that no other game does. Not so much innovating, so much as simply taking the established rules and mechanics and putting a new twist on them. Sailing was nothing new. Sailing around an open world was nothing new. 90% of Wind Waker's gameplay structure was lifted from previous games. Yet it remains one of those standout titles not just in gaming, but in a series whose framework really hasn't changed all that much for 30 years. It didn't do anything particularly new or innovative, it just did something different, something arguably better, and it achieved that by being bigger. In the other corner, we have a game that is simply too big. A game that could have been half its size and lost very little. A game that had a similar problem to Wind Waker and handled it way worse. This might be a controversial choice, as many people still enjoy this game nearly 8 years on, as do I. But I just have to talk about GTA 5. Ever since I first played it back in 2013, GTA 5 left a bad taste in my mouth for many reasons, chief among which being the open world. For a game that was billed as a pseudo-sequel to San Andreas, one of my favourite games, I was hyped to play GTA 5, but it just didn't stack up for me at all. You can't really talk about GTA's open world without talking about its mission structure. 3D Grand Theft Auto games had a very particular mission structure. You started on one island, and after a number of missions, you unlock the next one, then some more missions after that, and you unlock the third, and usually the rest of the game, signifying that you were reaching the story's end. GTA 5 was really the first main series game to eschew this idea, and opened the entire map from the get-go. I can definitely see why this might appeal to some. Having everything there in front of you is a great incentive to just go and dick around as and when you please. But I feel like something is lost in context when the world itself is just a big pinball machine to bounce around. To those who like the open world from the start, I don't want to harp on you for what you like, but let me ask you this. Is the satisfaction of earning something through your own effort not better than the quick gratification of instant rewards? For any other game, this might not be a problem. Once you get the King of Red Lions in Wind Waker and a couple of dungeons, the world is pretty much open to you. But you had to get that boat. You had to complete Dragon Roost and the Forbidden Woods. You had to peer out into the ocean, and you had to sail to those islands. You might find nothing. You might find a hidden side quest. You might even find the rest of the game waiting for you to stop playing around with pigs. Through your efforts, you are rewarded with more game to play. As I said, with any other game, this wouldn't be a problem. But with GTA, a series that once made you work for the rest of your open world, it made the game feel comparatively less. There was no sense of progression, because there was no progression. Just mission after mission after mission, in a world that felt less distinct than previous titles, because we were never forced to get used to a small area of the map before moving on to the next. And don't get me wrong, the intervening space of an open world isn't required to do anything. Some of the best don't. Empty space can often be just as necessary as the content that's sprinkled within it. But there's a difference between empty space that functions as nothing, as it should, and empty space that's just meaningless noise between gameplay instances. Wind Waker's Ocean and GTA 5's Los Santos were the glue that held the game together, but Wind Waker had the sense to let the glue dry. Open worlds that focus on sheer size often lose a lot when it comes to how content is distributed. From what I've seen, game designers tend to favour a very even and symmetrical spread of content. You get little clusters here and there where the main game lies, maybe some hub towns and some quests waiting for you, all dotted nice and evenly between open stretches of nothing, with the odd collectible to find. It's a method of open world design that crops up over and over again. I'm not saying it's a bad thing really, it's a tried and true formula for creating a cohesive game. But there's definitely work that can be done there, work that we'll talk about later on. The lesson we learn here is that it's not about how big your world is, but how you use your world and its space effectively. Emphasis on a bigger world only leads to a looser and more uncontrollable gameplay loop, whereas focusing more on what is done with the size of the world you have is what leads to tighter design. Necessity, after all, is the mother of invention. If you have no restrictions for your player to overcome, you have no need to implement any gameplay at all to surpass those restrictions, which just doesn't appeal to me as somebody who wants to design their own game. It'd be like Super Mario Bros. Getting rid of the Goombas to make it easier for the player to collect coins. I just feel like it's working against itself. So, to round out this paragraph, it's not the size, it's what you do with it, even if you do nothing at all. Factoring this into our own idea of an open world means that we shouldn't be afraid of having large open spaces. These kinds of environments, if done right, serve as a nice contrast to the main gameplay loop by de-escalating the player and slowing things down. The main thing we want to avoid though is making these open spaces completely devoid of anything. Having open spaces doesn't mean having our world consist of 90% flat land and 10% hub towns. It simply means that these kinds of areas don't need to be boring backdrops to the rest of the game. We need to design these spaces so that the player isn't thoughtlessly traipsing from one point to another. Even the smallest bit of interactivity is enough, just to keep the player engaged while preserving a more laid-back nature of these spaces. While how we actually move around these spaces is a discussion for another time, the actual space and how it's laid out can vary wildly depending on the size and aesthetic of your world. In a sci-fi game, these large open spaces could be just that, the vacuum of space. Or maybe a huge open spaceport, or the desolate surface of an alien planet. In a fantasy game, these spaces could be meadows and fields, forests, mountains, oceans, and deserts. These are all pretty standard environments in these kinds of games, but just because they're cliché, it doesn't mean you shouldn't use them. It's not so much what our environment is, it could be absolutely anything. It's how we use a particular environment to its fullest. You may have heard the word tighter up there in the previous section, and I meant that word deliberately, because it perfectly describes the next game up for discussion. The Soulsborne games, as they're often referred to, have some of the tightest open worlds I've ever seen in a game before. And if you've ever played them, you know exactly what I'm talking about. In fact, many of you might not even consider these games open world at all, but there's a great lesson here. Not only that we need to use our bigger maps more effectively, but how we can make the most out of even the smallest maps. For the uninitiated, Soulsborne games and their level-to-level world design is an absolute thing of beauty. It's difficult to summarise, so I'll pick out one example from Dark Souls 1, the painted world of Ariamis. This was the very first level to be designed for Dark Souls, and it's almost a shame that it's one of the best, considering there were 5 games after this. If you look at a map of the painted world, you can clearly see a beginning and an end. How you get from that beginning to that end is another story entirely. The painted world is not big. In fact, it's probably one of the smallest areas in the entire series. The thing that makes this map the best is that absolutely nothing is wasted. Not one single thing from this map is pointless. Everything works together to turn a 60-second stroll to the boss to a 60-minute maze of absolute peak level design. Everything is very vertical and non-linear. The level brings you up and down and around, it sends you to the very bottom and the very top, and every single inch has something. even if it's just a minor item or an enemy or even just a little bit of lore that just goes to spice this level up that little tiny bit further. Again, this level is something I could make a whole video about. Suffice to say, the Painted World takes the same problems of an open world and applies them to a similarly open but not quite as large level. For a level that most other games would have you traipse over in a matter of seconds, Dark Souls has provided a lot of content from a relatively small array of mechanics and map pieces. To keep going back to my point from earlier, nothing is new here, but it's framed in such a way that even with Dark Souls and its simple gameplay and small levels, we're able to get miles more content just by reconsidering how a player can get from one place to another. A consideration that was most certainly not made for arguably the worst level in the Souls series, Dark Souls 2's Black Gulch. This level is almost a perfect allegory for Dark Souls 2 as a whole. The exact same philosophy of vertical design is here to an extent. You can go up, down, and around the whole level. But the key difference here is that you don't need to do this. And this is the same point I was trying to make about GTA 5. If you can just walk from beginning to end with no obstacles to work around, have you really designed a game at all? Black Gulch might have a few enemies scattered around looking busy, and it might have a few items dotted around off the beaten path, but the items are mostly crap, and common strategy in Dark Souls is to just run by enemies because they're mostly a waste of time, and an unnecessary risk when you're so close to a boss fight. There are 2 bonfires within spitting distance of each other, and one of them is blocked by something you need to use a finite item to unblock, which is just not as good as having to navigate a challenging level to earn your bonfire, which in these games should be a reward, not a pit stop. In a game like Dark Souls where dying is common, it's frustrating to be sent back to the start of a level that you spent a long time working your way through. Shortcuts and checkpoints like that should be a reward for players who have made it through a complex and difficult level, rather than rewarding the player for running a few yards past a bunch of non-threats. The lesson we learn here is that even in levels as small as the Painted World or Black Gulch, the way we use our space isn't just about filling it with various flavours of sparkly objects to stimulate the magpie that lives within us all. It's about how you, as a game designer, make the player get those sparkly objects. Even the most useless item can feel somewhat rewarding to find if you had to put in a little work to get it. I feel like one of the best ways we can truly flesh out an open world is by not just considering how the player gets around, which is something we'll discuss next, but also what the player has to do to get around it. To add this lesson to our own open world, similarly to our open spaces, we need to consider the use of the space we have. Using these tighter, smaller spaces most effectively in our open world doesn't just mean throwing the player into a maze. It's not just about delaying the player from reaching their goal. It's about making the player craft their own path forward in subtle ways. I mentioned above that Dark Souls often rewards this kind of crafting with shortcuts, which is definitely something to consider. But it also features aspects that have been in open world games for decades. Keys, levers, pressure plates, buttons, whatever item or mechanism it may be that opens doors and barriers are all easy ways to make these areas not only more complex, but also more interactive, which is an absolute priority. The more tight-knit our environments become, the more complex they get, and by making use of simple, recognizable, and repeatable tools to provide more interactivity with the environment around the player, we can create tons of content from relatively simple principles. It just comes down to what those are, and how we use them to make the most of our space. While I think that keys and levers are always welcome, I think we can do more here. I think the best way to expand our range of tools isn't by contriving new ideas for its own sake. It's about fully utilizing the tools that we're already going to give to the player. If you give your player a weapon, like a gun or a sword, why not have them break stuff to progress? If the player can climb and jump around, why not feature some platforming in our levels? Don't just hide a key in a box on the way to the door that needs to be unlocked. Stick that box on a high ledge and make the player go get it. Make them shatter that box open with their weapon to claim their prize. Too simple? How about we stick the box on a ledge that we can't reach? If we can't get close enough, why not give the player a grappling hook or a gravity gun or telekinesis? They can pull the box towards them and get the key that way. And these are just examples of abilities we might just give the player as standard and using them to interact with some very simple puzzle mechanics. These spaces are at their best when the player has to really interact with them in a variety of ways, even with just the simplest of tools. We've talked about the problems that size can bring, and we've talked about how layout can help make the most of that size. All we need to consider now is how we might get around that space, and this is definitely something that needs its own video. I've mentioned before how I'm making my own game, and the way I want to get around an open world is something I've already decided upon. In fact, this video is meant to go hand in hand with the other, so if you'd like, after this video is over, why not check out my video on parkour systems? I'll be continuing some of my discussion in open worlds in that video, and it'll lead into how I went about programming my own parkour system for use in my own open world. All of this and more will either be already on the channel or coming up in the near future, so why not subscribe to Project Masquerade to keep up to date? Since I've already decided what movement system I want to use, and because there aren't really any mind-blowing examples out there, we'll just focus on the actual movement in an open world environment itself, and outline some of the best practices to stick to. How you get around an open world says a lot about you as a player. At least it speaks to a game's capacity to provide any player with the means of getting around it in a way that suits them. We'll take two of the games that we discussed above, Wind Waker and GTA 5. These games are pretty different when it comes to how their open worlds are structured and how we get around, but it doesn't matter what open world game we play, as players usually fall into one of two camps. I mentioned earlier that Wind Waker still has a very divisive critical reception, and that's because Wind Waker doesn't cater to one of these camps, not that it really has to. The first camp we'll call the leisure players. Players in this camp don't mind the long journeys that open world games often provide. If getting from one place to another involves a long, uninvolved ride through the world, then that's okay. Leisure players like the slowness of the experience in stark contrast to the other camp. The fast players don't like it when a game is pointlessly wasting their time. They've got places to be, and if there's a huge open stretch of nothing in their way that they have to get through, then that's not okay. Fast players have a game to get on with, and don't want to be stifled by long sections of relatively detached gameplay. So how can we serve both kinds of players when we seem so contradictory? Well, when we identify what these camps want, what these players expect when it comes to their own gameplay experience, we find that there's a happy medium that we can reach. Because these players might be near polar opposites of each other, but they are by no means unable to coexist in the same game. Leisure players have very passive needs when it comes to their experience. It's less about what they have to do and more about making the most of the features that are already going to be there. In a design sense, you don't really have to go out of your way to give these kinds of players anything, because the game world is often all they want. Leisure players thrive under the thumb of passive game design, things that aren't there to overtly affect the player, just things that are there because the director, producer, designer, programmer, artist, or composer put it there for its own sake. Some of the best open worlds are known for their rich and detailed environments. Skyrim is a great example of a game that really just lets you walk around in the nice forests and mountains while it plays some music. I've very often found myself just staring at the night sky and listening to Streets of Whiterun, right before an ice troll comes up behind me and ruins my chill vibes. And when I'm ready, I can go right back along my way to the nearest town and get some potions for my recently trollified face. This is what I mean by passive game design. Skyrim's huge open world and gorgeous soundtrack is going to be there regardless of what kind of player you are. But simply through its existence does it serve to create a nice gameplay experience for the leisure player, and is passive and unobtrusive enough to not get in the way of the fast player. So, how do we create a nice gameplay experience for the fast player? Well, again, Skyrim is a good open world. It wouldn't have been remade a million times if it wasn't. Its mass market appeal comes down to its ability to give most players the tools that they need to facilitate their own experience. In the case of fast players, Skyrim has provided a tried and tested tool utilized by hundreds of games before and after: fast travel. Here we see an example of active game design rather than passive. These are the mechanics that the player will actively use throughout the game. We could hike all the way to the nearest town and sell all of these possessions that I definitely didn't steal, or we could save ourselves the time and just fast travel there so I can get right back to not stealing everybody's stuff. It gets you to where you need to be in mere moments, but with one condition, which is the true crux of catering to the fast players and the leisure players. Fast travel in Skyrim, and a few other games with a similar mechanic, don't let you fast travel to somewhere you haven't been before, and therein lies the key. Leisure players are fine with a break in the gameplay for a while, and as a game designer it's easier to let them take that break. But fast players are ultimately here for gameplay, and most of the time it doesn't matter where it's even coming from. Leisure players might enjoy sailing the seas on the King of Red Lions, whereas fast players might enjoy the path to unlocking him. Leisure players might enjoy driving at the speed limit in GTA 5. Fast players might enjoy throwing their new cars off the side of a cliff to get to the next mission. Leisure players might enjoy exploring all the nooks and crannies of Lordran and Dark Souls. Fast players might feel rewarded when all that busy work has provided them with a shortcut or useful item. It's not about robbing Peter to pay Paul here. We don't have to burn one camp down just to give the other more space for tents. All that is required is to provide both with the simple means to help them play the game their way, which in an open world game can become quite varied. Different players will always expect different things, but we don't need to hurt the experience for some to enhance another's, at least not for my project. After all, one man's trash is another man's treasure. All we have to do as game designers is put in enough trash for everybody. Factoring all of this into our open world means that we need a great variety of the types of space that we have. In the parkour system video, we'll discuss the 3 types of environments I might expect to see in my own idea for an open world. But no matter what kind of environment you or I have, it's about striking an effective balance that is not only natural to our world's design and aesthetic, not only natural to the pacing of the gameplay, but a balance that is able to cater to every kind of player. Our large open spaces should be visually interesting enough for players that choose to indulge their time in traversing them, but also provide the freedom of faster or instant travel to others that would rather indulge their time elsewhere. Our more complex spaces should offer a nice, meaty challenge when it comes to getting around, but also provide more and more effective means of conquering these challenges. It's all about variety here. Railroading the player when it's necessary is fine. Every open world game has a time and a place for making the player knuckle down and getting some questing done. But it's also important to know when to let loose the leash and provide more options when it comes to not just what we interact with, but how. There are 2 ways a designer can approach how they craft an open world. They can create the world first and come up with the content later, or they can create the world to suit the kind of content that they already have. Both approaches are equally valid, but we'll take a look at both and see what information we can glean from them. First is to create our world and fill in the rest later. This approach is good for a couple of reasons, specifically in that it offers more freedom down the line when it comes to the type of content you can add. Open worlds are very often just blank canvases for any game developer to throw in whatever ideas that they want. Having that canvas there and ready to accept content makes the world feel more natural in my mind. It doesn't feel like this specific thing was added here for the player. It just feels like it was always there. This castle wasn't just added so that I can explore a castle, it was always here as a truly integrated part of this world. This kind of open plan distribution of content allows game developers more freedom when it comes to the kind of content they're making. This world, this stage, this level was not purpose built for the player to use this one specific thing right here, right now, in order to progress. It's just there. This approach is most often seen in sandbox games, and while I'm not making a sandbox game, there's a very interesting point of discussion we can examine called emergent gameplay. Emergent gameplay is the idea that players will find ways to use game mechanics in a fashion that the game developers didn't expect or intend. This approach opens itself up to emergent gameplay because the world's not specifically built for the content that's put in it. It's the other way around. This is best seen in Minecraft, where the world is procedurally generated, and therefore can't be purpose-built for specific interactions. The only interactions the player has come about because of the small range of tools you have to work with. I'm sure Mojang never really expected players to use water source blocks to break their fall, but players do it anyway. On the other hand, they expect you to go fight the Ender Dragon, but you could play this game for literal years without ever doing that at all. Creating the world first and the content second is a great way to structure an open world game that has no real structure at all, but at the same time affords a lot of control to what that direction might become. The only real drawback of this approach is that with no direction comes no control. You run the risk of having a large gap between your gameplay and your game world. Minecraft works because the world around you is made to be altered cube by cube, and the tools given to you are made for that purpose. You can design whatever world you want, but until the content is actually there, it's impossible to know if that world is too much, or even not enough. Now we've shaved off valid gameplay to stuff into our world, or tack on some unnecessary stuff to fill it out, or we might even have to go back and change the world itself, which is time consuming and pretty much just lands you at the second approach. Creating the world first to add content later is like a blank canvas. It can bear a masterpiece akin to a Renaissance painting, or it can bear an MS Paint drawing of a house. A good start doesn't always mean a good finish. The second approach is creating a world that fits the content we already have, which I think is a better approach for my project. A common problem with open world games is that content is often stretched far too thin. If you've ever played one, you'll know that they almost always feature practically meaningless collectibles that are just there for the sake of 100% completion, and they're very often just out there in the open for you to pick up. The Batman Arkham games are great examples of how a game can make you work for your collectibles by turning them into neat little puzzles. The world was already there, and the game designers just threw a bunch of padding in to stretch out the runtime. The great thing about this approach is that it allows us to truly put work into actual gameplay and design our world around a stronger core, rather than spreading ourselves too thick or too thin with a game world that isn't right for the direction we ended up going in. If we know what we want our player to do, it's easier to set up the world around them for the player to interact with it. If my player can jump 50 feet in the air and fly around, then I want to make a world that gives him the space to do that. If my player floats around at the speed of sound, it would be better to build the world around their speed. If I can run up walls and jump across rooftops, then I better give them plenty of opportunity to use that ability. This is precisely why I'm designing the gameplay mechanics first in a malleable testing environment, because the content we make, the tools we provide the player, the abilities the player has at their disposal, all these factors decide what kind of open world that we end up making. Even things we'll discuss later on in future videos will influence this decision. Things like progression and aesthetic all play into forming the big lump of clay that is an open world. Making that world first might offer an environment to experiment with gameplay ideas, but ultimately the world isn't necessary to do that. It's easy as an independent developer to fall into the trap of designing things in the wrong order. Creating a small map to play around with basic tools and free assets is easier than designing and programming real gameplay mechanics. I know because that was the first thing I did with Unity when I downloaded it like 10 years ago. The lesson we should take away here is that planning is key, and having real, concrete ideas of your creative vision is absolutely paramount. Both approaches listed above are valid, but only as long as you know what you're actually doing. The kind of content you want in your open world isn't really important, it's entirely up to you, but that decision will affect the open world that you end up making. The world is amorphous enough to be molded around your content, but once your content is set, it will not afford you that same flexibility. Applying this to our open world again branches out into another discussion for a very important aspect of a game's initial design. Before we even start creating a world in our game engine of choice, we should probably start thinking about putting our ideas on paper. Concept art is very much its own beast, and definitely warrants its own video, so we'll leave that for another time. We now know that our open world and its content shouldn't be dependent on its size, but rather its size should be enough to appropriately house the content, even when none is present. We know that how a player gets around and traverses the world is just as important as what they're actually doing in that world, and we know that when it comes to our open world, the range of gameplay mechanics we provide allows all kinds of players with the freedom to do as they wish. Within reason, of course. But is that really it? Is there something we missed? While there are a number of basic rules we can use as a basis for an open world game, there is so much more that has to go into one to truly bring it to life. And all of those things could easily make for their own videos, because all of those things warrant not only their own discussions, but their own tailoring to fit to our creative vision for our own projects. My open world will not only influence design decisions that I will make in the future, it will be influenced by decisions that I've already made, or have yet to make. I brought up the parkour system earlier. This is another system that was influenced by the way I want my open world to be, and the parkour system itself will then influence the open world right back. That's why I said they work in tandem together. One changes the other. Open worlds live or die, depending on how you get around them. Everything I've talked about today are all decisions that affect one simple facet of the range of factors that go into creating your own idea of a perfect world. This video was just to lay out the basics, so we have a better foundation to build our other ideas around. In our next video, we'll get a little more specific and explore yet another facet of our open world game design, and see if we can start bringing it to life. In the left corner, you'll see my video on the parkour system and the research I did in terms of designing my own. In the right corner, if it's been uploaded yet, you'll see the next open world video, where we'll discuss open world mission structures and what my own might look like. I hope you guys have a good day, and thank you for watching. See you next time.